what is an assessment? You know, since the title is integrating assessments into the program. So it really can be any sort of data collecting measure that you would have, and they are used throughout all business sectors, educational sectors, even for us poor lowly extension people, when you go to any of our programs and you have to either pre or post looking for impact, a lot of times for extension it could be because they need information for grants, fulfilling grants, but essentially we are doing assessments. Education-wise, whether it's be standardized testing, regular testing, looking at how you might test the student, that all is part of it. The SWOT analysis for businesses, and then whether you're looking at safety assessments, threat assessments, and or individual self-awareness. So whether it's the personality, how you get along with somebody, you know, what career best suits you and whatnot, they're all assessments. So if you're looking at us in terms of the sports turf industry or the grounds industry, so this talk is really going to look at some sports turf or field issue, or I'm going to touch upon that, and I'm going to touch about some landscape stuff too. So it's not, since it's sustainable landscape stuff, it's not just going to be about turf, even though sometimes I'd really prefer it to be that. So when you look at really what an assessment is or what we're really using right now, it could be something as getting the plant tissue analysis. It could be looking at a soil test and getting that information, so that would help you along. It could be a state assessment like the one that we utilize now in Connecticut with some of the school grounds managers. I know Ohio State has one, Cornell has one. There's a good number of them out there. And it could be our very own, you know, playing condition index that we use for some of our natural grass fields. But all that record keeping is all assessment driven, so that we have information. And and why do we want that? Because really, if we're really looking at what we want to accomplish, we really need to ask ourselves some deep, hard questions about the care of the properties that we manage. You know, so we want to be specific. So, for example, do I have a safe playing field, or am I really doing what I need to do to provide a safe playing field? You want to look at the goals that you want to achieve, essentially, and select assessments that will really help you perform the best possible way that you can. So, for the objectives, and when you fill the talk, you know, when you wish to speak, you know, you're doing in March, I think. So I put down these assessments well before the talk had been prepared, in part to highlight some of the work that had been ongoing up in Connecticut. But I want to just make it clear, and hopefully you'll take away from today's presentation why it might be valuable to have an assessment for your school grounds, whether it's the athletic fields, whether it's the landscaped areas, and hopefully you can see a little bit how the assessments might fit into an integrated pest management program. So to set the tone and to set the pace, and for some of you, if you've heard me speak up here before, it's been based on some of the pesticide-free programs that we've had at the up in Connecticut. So for those of you that aren't aware of it, we had a pesticide ban go into place in 2010, July 1 of 2010. I was hired November of 2010, so it was right after that. And there have been a few years prior to that where people were trying to see how they were going to adjust to this. But bottom line is they were sort of just waiting. And then July 1 hit, and boom, life changed for a good number of the sports turf managers up there. The ban goes from daycare to grade 8. Unless you're an adjoining junior, senior high school, and if your fields aren't well marked and separated from the junior high schoolers, then the ban would exist for some of the high school fields as well. But bottom line, for the bulk of this issue, as we started to hear from some of the sports turf managers, we started to realize that there really was very little information in terms of assessments, in terms of field care that we were dealing with. So, you know, we experienced quite a range of quality for the sports turf managers. We had some really sound programs that were out there in the state. Dense, healthy turf, things looked really great. We could have had just some worn areas and some goal mouth areas, but they looked really good. But then again, we could have the range of quality where it was nothing being done in some of the other highly visible turf areas. And even in terms of athletic fields, a good number of the school grounds folks are not coming from turf backgrounds. They could be engineers by trade. In fact, the big picture up there, the fellow really was an engineer by trade and started working in facilities in the school grounds. It could be somebody that was, some other custodial practice, whether it's plumber or electrician, when they're dealing with that. And then they get saddled with taking care of the outside of the buildings. And so then the issue there is without that lack of expertise or that knowledge, then they're taking face value to whatever one of the commercial reps that would be coming by into the area would want them to know. So it could be something very substantial and very sound, and then again it could be deviate from that. And so, for example, we had this town here, it was a fairly wealthy town. The fellow had no real idea about turf care, and he contracted out for overseeding and some fertility programs, and they were not overseeding until the end of November, because it fit the commercial reps' schedule better, and this person couldn't argue because he figured end the season, end the game. Plus, they were also using very little seed in their overseeding program, and so it's that kind of knowledge differential that we were really dealing with, particularly in this municipal and ground sector. So with the ban in place, what we were seeing over the years, and it's been 10 years now since the ban has been in effect, we've seen that there still can be a lack of budget support for additional work and labor. We've also seen a wide range. It's changing a little bit now, but certainly initially there was quite a diversity in terms of the interpretation of how to work with the ban. So some folks basically threw their hands up and said, I'm doing nothing. I'm sort of a wait-and-see attitude. Maybe they had the thought process that all of a sudden the following year the legislation would undo the ban that was in place, which obviously has not happened. But we certainly saw quite a range to that. We also saw activities that were being moved. If there were school properties where the ban was in place, they would be moved to adjacent municipal properties where the turf was in better condition. Part of that could have been because there was pesticide use on those properties, but certainly it made a difference in terms of the field quality and the field care. And then over the years, what we have seen now is some people are rethinking how, with limitations maybe still to their budgets, how they can readdress and refocus some of these turf care and landscape care practices. So they've been looking at prioritizing fields for labor and budget purposes and whatnot. So as I said, I'll go through a couple of these. With the in place, we definitely saw increased labor costs, and it still is pretty hard to quantify from the standpoint that each school is different. You have cities, you have districts where the schools have their own grounds personnel. Then you get into the other ones where there isn't anybody and it's a custodian. You get contracts out, and they take the labor portion out. So when you're really trying to piecemeal it all together, it's not like a hard and fast. We just know that with the change, certainly there was at least a two to three times more greater expense with some of the ban once it was in place. It was just more labor intensive. As I said, we've seen some districts that are very creative and they have a nice relationship with a neighboring community. So if they didn't have the equipment in place or they were looking to have a cost share, so to speak, on some equipment, they tried to do some very creative things to help allow them to have some of the equipment and the pieces in place to move the process forward. Then again, we had some catastrophic issues. This was really early on in the process, and I will say over the last 10 years, what we have noticed is they're not as severe as this. We have one or two that we have reports on over time. Do people have grub issues? Absolutely. And then they just try to work through it and deal with it. But in this case, early on in the ban, the grounds manager certainly had no turf background, and they shut the field down to the point that they let it go. They really didn't do much they did overseeding late in the year with a contractor, and by the time it came in for springtime, the way they really tried to adjust to it was keep the field closed, put out the little fake coyote posters, so that would also help keep some geese off, so they thought, since the field was in disarray, and put signage up and said you can't use the field. And then they turned around and shipped the kids to minor league baseball facility that they paid fees for to use the facilities for municipal events. So, that's an extreme of what happened, but it did happen, and it was ongoing for a number of years. There were 4 or 5 communities that tried to utilize these fields and these from these professional services. But what we have seen in general with the ban is that people are really becoming more protective of their fields. They're prioritizing their fields so that they might be adding greater turf care practices to their high-end fields, and then the ancillary areas surrounding, they might not be doing anything, or they're really limiting what they're putting on there so they can see some differences. And also getting protective from the standpoint that if you had user groups or parent groups that used to just come in and just sort of take over an area because it was town property and they could hold, whether it's a yoga session, whatever else, the fact of the matter is that the grounds managers have been in general trying to keep people off their priority turf areas. Go them somewhere else and trying to have communication, but in general that's what they've been trying to be more protective of their properties. With regard to some of the landscape areas at the time of the ban that occurred, some of the high visible areas, we had some real changes in terms of care. So in the past, everybody would maybe use a pre-emergent, even for grassy weed control, in the athletic fields, and then they would treat some of their landscape beds for grassy weed control, broadleaf weed control, sort of let it go as the turf season really kicked in, and they were devoted to mowing, line painting, taking care of the athletic fields. And then in the summer when school was out of session, they might get back in and try to clean up some of the areas. But it was really more close to the time or the advent that school started. So with the ban, again, what they really started to see was it was way too labor intensive to look at and treat things the way they had in the past in terms of waiting to the end of the year. You had huge areas of weeding, then you're hiring summer help, you're limited in terms of the people that are available for staff anyway, and it was just altogether all too time consuming. Then they also looked at some of the periphery areas. Maybe they, if they had to make a judgment call, just like they were prioritizing their athletic fields, then they're making judgment calls in terms of what areas. The areas that were real focal points around the school were those areas that they focused on, and then they let the border areas, the periphery areas go if need be. Around the same time that after the first couple years of the ban came into play, we also had that horrific shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. And at that time then, it was also an urgency for all the school grounds managers to really not even evaluate their landscape properties, but to get in there and make entrances and around window areas clean as possible. So in the past, if you had some areas where some overgrown shrubbery were, or if, again, as I said, if they were prioritizing some of their landscape needs, that might have not been something that they would really think about. They had to get in there and really look to open up some areas and make everything fairly visible. So from that standpoint, they had to refocus some of their energy, as I said. So maybe this particular school had shrubbery that was up over the windows, but bottom line is they had to remove some of the unsightly areas. All right, and so it was the wrong plant. It could have been the wrong plant, wrong place from the get-go, day one, in terms of what they were dealing with. But they basically tried to look at minimizing some of the landscape right around some of the schools, and if for nothing else, because it's so exceedingly labor-intensive to really care for the properties. So, and then you look at some of the landscape areas, again, in the periphery and the fence lines. We've seen some that are really trying to put either the rubber or, do something along the fence line area so that now when they're mowing, instead of weed whacking and being labor and time consuming, they're looking to take the mower as close as they can as the fence line. So when they're mowing the fields, they don't have to go back and do anything different with that. So there's some effort to really incorporate some of the different products from that standpoint. But bottom line, in terms of developing these assessments, the idea was to look at the athletic fields to support, and encourage player safety. And then in the landscape areas, since it's not the player safety that you're looking, but it's the health and safety of those that are utilizing the school properties. It's looking at reducing threats from that standpoint. And it really came into also improving aesthetics, because that was the highly visible location. People could see your athletic fields, and they could see over time there'd be wear issues if there were amendments to that. But looking at the front of the schools, around the schools, the staff, the students, the parent groups that were using it really felt it really impacted more of a quality of life for those areas. So because of that, in 2014, let's see if I can do it this way. I'm part of the IPM team at UConn. We have a fruit specialist in there, greenhouse specialist in that. We have, I'm trying to think who else is on the program, right? A vegetable specialist, and I handled school IPM. And so we started implementing a lot of school IPM workshops, and at the same time, we really tried to look at developing an assessment tool. And so the assessment tool really started in 2011, 2012, and sort of went into 2013 in terms of how we were engaging some of this information. And essentially what we ended up doing is we had about 27 different schools we worked with. So I'm going to tell you right now that some of the little charts that I'm going to put up later on we talk about, it's not a highly research-driven situation here. We tried to do this so that we thought we could have demonstration sites, key teaching moments, training moments for some of our school IPM workshops. That was sort of the thrust behind some of this as we developed the assessment forms. So we worked with a number of communities. We had a couple, we got and the way I basically developed the list was people that might have attended some of our turf programs in the past, so some of our school IPM workshops, maybe turf field day, and I basically sent everybody an email, and some of the people that we selected were people that were first to respond and said, yeah, I want to take part in it. Other ones we might have made some phone calls because we wanted to try to disperse this across the state. So we have, 8 counties in the state. We wanted to have a good number of representation from each of those areas. And at the same time, and I'll touch on it at the very end, we also had tried to incorporate some weather stations as a tool for the school grounds managers. So we were, again, looking for even distribution across the state from that standpoint. But bottom line, we needed this quantitative data to really measure field quality, field safety, and whatnot. So this was the assessment form that we came up with. And we've modified it and tweaked it a little bit, but that is what we tried to utilize. We had a special payroll, a summer employee. The way the grant was written, it was really done more in the summertime. And so, and I was fortunate enough, actually, for the athletic fields, I had Dr. Bill Dest, who's been retired at 20-some years from the turf program at UConn, but this has always been an issue and an interest of his. And so Bill actually went out across the state and took a lot of the data. So it was sort of cool having his eyes and in terms of the thought process on the assessment fields. But what we really tried to look at, so I want to see if I can point this out. So the page 1 here, we got basic general field health information, and then we tried to develop a turf rating system for overall turf health. So the issue is all along is it was all perceived, no quantitative data, no numbers that we could assign in terms of field health. From there, we also had a program where the fertility programs could be listed, other cultural management practices, and then our pest management page and the field diagram at the end. So when we started to look at this in terms of athletic fields, we were really looking at the playing surface. Obviously, we tried to give it some ratings in terms of this, how much turf cover might be there, the smoothness of the field, the surface from that standpoint, were there depressions, were there irregularities in the field, and so everything got a score. So if I went back to the field here, this number, this turf rating, it was this number plus this number gave us a number here. Then this number plus this gave us another number, so these two together gave us this overall rating, and this was just the field use information that we were trying to gather as well on that. So you put that all together, and that information gave us our scores. Bill would go out, he would assess the fields, so spring and fall. I would say once things started to grow, so it was more early May-ish when he would get out there to get to the fields. And then again, he was looking at the fields, and this is one of the negatives or the timing of the grant, because the way the grant would end, it ends in August. So for us to time it, really, Bill sort of crossed that line a little bit, was doing it into September, but officially our grant was like end of August, so the information, the data collecting really was done in that summertime period. But he would look at some of the weed populations, he'd transect the field, take a percentage in his number of different transect areas, and then compile that, and then we'd sort of average it out to get a number from the areas. So this was just sort of a situation where he would do it. He'd note which weeds were maybe prevalent in the field as well, and we'd have the information. So bottom line, what did we learn is very simplistic. We learned exactly or basically it supported a lot of the information that has been coming out of research programs over the years, not just UConn's, just anybody that's been trying to look at field safety. Dave Minner was one of the first ones when he talked about, high overseeding rates. So we learned that the overall rating and the conditions of the field certainly improved with an increased rate of overseeding. It increased the turf cover, which could be turf and some weeds in general, but the overall appearance, the turf cover improved as we increased the fertility program and took care of that field, and the overseeding and the uniformity of the field also increased from that standpoint. So even though the original intent was to train, we had some substance information that we could use to substantiate and say, we're not nuts. This is what we're seeing. So, and then in terms of looking at turf quality ratings, again, in terms of density, on a well-maintained, good height of cut, especially it was like 2 1/4 inch, and then actually to 2 1/2. We had some good turf quality ratings. Again, the higher height of cut on some of the municipal fields where you're taking that information into consideration, the higher height of cut might have had more exposure with weeds and whatnot. So again, the turf quality was a little bit diminished from that. So again, in terms of fertilizer applications, you get on some of these school grounds, particularly these elementary schools, a lot of them were fertilized once a year. So, but if you had a turf manager there that understood the value of fertility program and could get their fields in a little better stead, then certainly we saw that same standard of increase in terms of turf quality, and the same with any of the best practices that they might work with. All right. Visually, if you're looking at irrigated fields versus non-irrigated fields, we saw in the irrigated fields a lot more Dutch-way clover or clover that would be on the fields, and it would really take it over. And in fact, we've had a couple of conversations, Dr. Henderson and myself, with Bill Dest over the years, because Bill we looked at it like, well, turf cover is better than no cover. And that's true. If all you have is clover and you're looking for footing and stability, you're getting that more with your turf grass crop than you are with some of the broadleaf weeds that would be in place. But you saw a rampant increase in clover and poa annua, obviously, on these in these irrigated athletic fields. In the non-irrigated athletic fields, we saw certainly a lot more open areas, knot weeds, the first weed that we would see in the spring that would come out and would stay in that area, and then you might see goosegrass or some crabgrass in some of the other areas, but you really saw some differences in terms of the type of weeds that were in place. We also found in terms of turf cover, in terms of these non-irrigated fields, that obviously the better irrigated the field, the better the turf cover. That would make sense, even if it was some weed. I'm calling a turf cover, but a cover, more or less. But we also saw the non-irrigated fields were harder surfaces. at every field. And I digress, because when Bill started this process, we took a soil test of all the athletic fields so that we had a baseline from that standpoint. And then Bill regularly also did GMAX testing on these fields when he went out. So it wasn't just visual rating of the weeds, weeds and whatnot, and then just getting the information. So we always did GMAX testing. And then if we were looking at the data to compare, so this overall field rating, just so you can see, we had used this at a school IPM program. Did I mess that up? Push this button here. This was the compilation of the scores that we used from that lower half of that first page on the assessment when we were trying to get a rating score on that. And to be honest with you, part of the concern for some of these school grounds guys is they felt that if they had poor quality rated fields, if they got a poor surface cover, well, that was a direct reflection upon their care. They didn't want their administration to be thinking that they're not doing their job, when some of it was just their limitations in terms of some of the actual tools and whatnot that they had. So that's the overall field condition, and it would directly correlate with turf cover, percent weeds, the smoothness, and some of that I had mentioned to you earlier. And then on the non-irrigated fields, we had the same type of situation, but where the average, let's say on the rating on the irrigated fields, I should back up a bit here, if I can show you, was about an average on an 8, and on our first page on our ratings, 8 to 11 was our category of good. 12 to 15 was our category of excellent. And so 8 is really, the next category below that was fair. And so that was like 4 to 7. So it's really on the lower end of good when you're looking at some of these athletic fields with some of the wear. You get to the non-irrigated fields, and then the overall conditions, I keep on hitting that back, I'm sorry, changed so that the overall rating was poor. And we had a couple of fields where Bill would come back and say, those fields should just be shut down. We had high GMAX. They were unsafe. They were like cement. But, nothing, it was the soil that was brought in, and nothing was really ever done to amend it. But these poor kids played on it day in and day out. So we had certainly totally different information in terms of surface hardness with the non-irrigated to the irrigated fields. So again, going back to some of the landscape properties where we had some of the overgrown areas, in terms of the school based on how they used to maintain them in the past, the next thing is now we have this field assessment for the next thing, so let's work on a landscape assessment form. And that took a little bit more time, and it's a little bit more in depth. Part of it is you get a turf surface out there, even if you have 2 different species, it's still a uniform turf surface. You get into a landscape area, and you're dealing with totally different plants, growth habit, everything about them. So how do you quantify, how do you try to rein that in terms of how you're going to assess an area? And so this really ends up being, I will say, I think still, even though we try to attribute numbers to it and whatnot, but it's still a little bit more subjective in terms of some of the care. So we tried to assign numbers. We tried to follow the same thing where we looked at cultural management. We gave it scores in terms of how things were maintained, and that would, end up there depending on how it was rated. And then after that, so that could be irrigation, fertility program, that kind of thing for that. And then we looked at plant selection as the next big factor in terms of assessing the landscape area, and then the plant health and pest issue is the bottom. So bottom line, in this scoring, we tried to say like 45 to 35 was excellent, 34 to 25 good. And, there were a lot more factors, a lot more parameters into that the form, just in general. And we've sort of revised it consistently over time. And so what we learned, again, in terms of the assessments was when we were looking at health, so first of all, there were a good number of properties where once plants went in around a building, nothing was done to them, period. No irrigation, no fertility, no mulch in some instances were put around the beds. So that's sort of like the numbers, when I'm looking at the numbers here, it's like this was nothing. Never fertilized, never mulched, never irrigated. Then you could look at the extreme here where this grounds manager fertilized at least once a year, maybe more, mulched at least once a year, maybe more, so replenish that and irrigate it as needed. So there was, again, this disparity in terms of care, in terms of the overall health. And if you looked at the overall health, though, bottom line is, it was okay. It wasn't great, but they still were, could be a few that were above average. And so maybe in that, put my score back, that were in that maybe 25-ish range, 25-ish range. And a lot of that was plant selection that really impacted, some of the scores from that standpoint. So where I had Bill Dest as my turf expert that was working with me, I had somebody that had a good horticultural background that was going out and working with the school grounds managers and assessing the landscape beds in those areas. So it was nice from that standpoint. So again, the other thing that we learned was in terms of the plant material, you could have a landscape area around that had many plants in it, but very few native plants. And I talk about this now because this is the big thing. The pollinators, save the bees, work in the landscape, and this is where in the school properties this is really affecting some of that area. So we had very many plants, few natives in general, and then if they had few plants, they even had less natives from that standpoint. And then, but a lot of these plants that were planted are also on the invasive list. So Connecticut, just like many other states, have their own invasive plant list. A good number of the plants that were on the school properties were privet, barberry, burning bush, all on these invasive lists. So we had, even if we had few plants, we could have had a high number of those that were invasive plants. And then bottom line is when we were looking to readdress whether it was because of the security issues that prompted a lot of the reevaluation of the plants around the schools, and if they were removing the plants, they weren't removing because they identified themselves as invasive. They were removing plants because the maintenance cost and the maintenance care that went around to these plants were the key overriding issue. So what did we see? So we, again, saw that they, really had to clean up, make high visible areas open and exposed. And then what we've tried to talk about over time, and we've developed like a list of native plants or plants that you could utilize in some of these areas, but to really open up and use some of these dwarf cultivars, species that are out there in terms of plant, like one is the deer villa, like it's a nice low growing, attracts pollinators, but it's just not going to get more than 2.5 feet tall. So if you had areas, it's really, really looking at the right plant, right place. So really looking and taking into account the mature size of the plant rather than anything else from that standpoint. And then we've tried to integrate it in terms of working with some of the parent groups everywhere else that we can, but anyway, that was the issue there. And what we also saw was those where they incorporated evergreens when there was an issue. Like this year, we had a lot of problems with some of not only rhododendron up in New England area, but some of the juniper and some of the other plants. But where you had areas where evergreens were in place, like in the picture on the left with the globe arborvitae, and there was damage to it, it was unsightly. And so, and it sat there. So then they're either removing branches. So now you have these misshapen plants. So we've seen a lot of people go away from some of the low growing, or, some of the evergreens around the school properties. And they're looking to either native grasses, things that can fill in, but again, be contained height-wise, or they're looking at something like Ruscrolo. That's a nice plant that can be used. And if the snow falls on it, you can prune it back, but it still fills in a really nice size and height. The other thing that we saw, just want to see one time, okay. The other thing that we saw, the school grounds managers were really, just as in the athletic fields, they were looking to prioritize their fields in terms of turf care and how they would expend their budgets to support those fields. We saw the same thing or are seeing the same thing in terms of landscapes. So we have some of the school grounds guys that are refocusing. They removed a lot of plant material and basically created focal points, maybe right around the school entryways. They also were looking at it from the standpoint of bloom period. An awful lot of this plant material that was planted when the buildings get placed are are plants that maybe aren't in flower when school's in session. You know, they're blooming at different times. So try to be looking at bloom time and looking at some of the other factors when they're creating these focal points. So it looks inviting when you walk in to the buildings. So we have like some of these blue ribbon schools, and so that was important for them to keep that certain areas highly visible, even if it's around the signage for the school. The other thing we saw is some of the turf managers really took out, you know, as I showed one of those pictures where they clear cut the landscape areas, they will try to mow as close as possible to the buildings. Saves in labor. It's easier to mow than it is to do individual weeding and treating the mulch and whatnot. So if they can get on the non-visible areas, mow right to the building, that's what really they attempted to do. And again, like I said, just to sort of create the focal points. Then we also saw that in some of the out-of-play areas, the periphery areas, maybe that's where you could start to look at increasing some pollinator habitat, maybe utilizing the milkweed, keeping things in place from that standpoint, creating an open strap, minimize your mowing. You can do some things in different areas. It might take some labor to establish it and get it going, but over time you can minimize some other overall effort with that. Keep some tall grass in around playground areas or whatever have you that really can help you refocus your amount of the effort that would go into that. We also really have tried to stress, so this actually is Newtown. This is the new elementary school that they put in place, and they loaded it with plant material, and some of the plant material that they put in is not appropriate for the site. So they're starting out with problems from the get-go. So the two factors that we really are trying to address from this standpoint is look at your budget. What truly do you have for a maintenance budget to maintain these plants once they're established, and plant the right place for the right site. Shade, you plant it when it has some shade. You don't put a shade-loving plant in full sun because you're going to end up with weed issues and the plant's going to be stressed from the get-go. So those are some of the issues that we've looked at over time. Using assessments to support IPM protocol. So IPM, we certainly try to promote that in the state, although some of our state legislators have tried to change the definition of IPM for us during the course of these last 10 years. The number one problem for the turf managers and in landscape and in the athletic fields are weeds. So that's their biggest pest issue. They've identified it. It's consistent. So how can we address that in turf care? So if you can understand and identify what, and I'm saying this for those of you that do not live the luxury that we live in Connecticut or New York State where we have these bans in place. If you have the time to really think about some of this in terms of your care, because it will happen, whether it's going to happen by town or by county like in Maryland, you know, there are some that all of a sudden you're forced to deal with this differently. But in terms of weeds being the primary issue, if you are looking at taking care of the grounds, and you can identify which weeds, for example, are more problematic for you, then you can adjust your turf care, your best care practices to help keep that turf dense and healthy and minimize the encroachment of some of those weeds. So this is the page 3 of the athletic field assessment form that we had, and certainly that gives you the opportunity to identify your broadleaf weeds in your athletic fields or in your turf areas, what grassy weeds you have there, insects or disease issues if you have any historical information from that standpoint. Because it's really the historical record keeping that will really help and fall into place and support you as you move along. So this was the landscape form. This is the athletic field that I just showed you. And then the bottom half of the athletic field form, too, is we also sort of had a diagram of an athletic field. So if you knew where you had some of these issues at times, whether for spot treating, maybe seeding in only your heavily used areas to reduce the weeds in those areas, whatever you're doing, but you could certainly incorporate them in terms of your pest care practices. All right. So thanks to somebody here in the audience, I won't name him by name, but I was greatly appreciative because this is one sports turf manager that took what we had to heart and really tried to utilize this as a record-keeping tool. And so he filled out these assessment forms and has consistently used them. And it's been great to work with him because we know we have the data from him. He's appreciative because he says he likes the forms, but it has really helped him in terms of his IPM plan. And then he took it so far as to incorporate listing the assessment forms into his state-mandated IPM plan that he has to have, so that when he's going to utilize certain tactics to maintain the fields, that he has some of this information at hand and written into his IPM plans. So this was just like a couple of snippets from his IPM plan, but if he has got to identify, for example, in the ornamental plant material, the non-pesticide tactics that he needs to use or the pesticide product that he needs to use, that he has them listed, he has them in hand, because none of the schools can go in there and just arbitrarily select something. They have to, in the IPM list, that they've gone through the least toxic steps to get to a point where maybe they need to use a product. And for us in Connecticut, it's the minimum risk products. So nothing with an EPA registration number can be used, and there's really very little efficacy data anyway on some of this material for them. But you could do the same thing. He did the same thing in turf in terms of the products he might use, in terms of insecticides, herbicides. So it's all listed right there, but he's gone through it and incorporated that into the IPM plan. So moving forward, it's just really critical to keep on do the record keeping. I see the golf course superintendents are regularly, really keeping tabs on, some of their programs and their record keeping. And here in this sports turf arena, I see it more collegiate, maybe private facilities, but a lot of municipal and school grounds guys really aren't as good at record keeping as maybe they should be to help support themselves. It really needs to be an integral part of the process. And if for anything, that was one of the learning tools that we took away. Like, we thought people were going to embrace this right away, take the record, and a lot of the thought process, I have enough on my plate, mowing, line painting, taking care of things that I'm not going to take 5 or 10 minutes out of my day to make some notes that would help me, in the future, because they can't see beyond the actual day-to-day work that they're doing. But it certainly can help. So then the idea is, how can you turf managers better use these assessments to support your messages? So if you are looking to purchase equipment, purchase supplies, you change a tactic on, or if for nothing else, arguing on field usage. All that can come into play when you have some of this data on hand when you need to, speak to somebody. I'm not saying it's going to be, you're going to win every time, but it certainly will go a long way to buy credibility for those of you that haven't been record keeping. It'll enhance that. And then we've talked about utilizing new tools. So in the new tools, one of them was, I mentioned, the weather stations that came out of the grant. Not everybody has access to the high-end equipment, irrigation equipment, sensors, what have you, but everybody pretty much can dial into a weather station nearby. Ag production has used weather stations for years. It was a whole new thing with schools. That's a talk for another time, but I will say that those that have utilized this also as a new tool have incorporated some of that into the assessment in their IPM protocol. They can look at weed using growing degree days. They can look for weed emergence, insect emergence, what have you, and try to manipulate that into the plan. So they can go on Google, get some information. As I said, most of it's more for vegetable and fruit, but there is some turf information that's out there in terms of weather station data. And then from the university end, we've tried to work with some of the new tools that are available. So for the Connecticut schools in 2017, they changed the law. it was more through a budget. It wasn't in the exact law. So now municipal playgrounds fit into this ban, and at the same time they allowed some biologicals into the program. So in the past where they really couldn't use anything, now they can use like the new product like Grub Gone for grubs. The BT Galleria is a product that now they have that they didn't have in the past. But then they have other biologicals now that are coming out that really haven't been thought of for some practices and so it's just one of these things that they need to still think outside of the box. So the idea of new tools, even if it's using drones, anything that you can use to help with your record keeping and observational data is critical. So, as I'm winding down here, what I want you to know is really documentation will really help provide you a really positive role as a sports turf manager in maintaining your fields, and the same thing in terms of the landscape. So this year also in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Eastern Massachusetts, we had EEE. We had issues where people were wanting to spray, not spray overall, and some of this record keeping will help with looking at the health and safety of the students that are utilizing the fields, because they curtailed evening sports, early morning sports, for captain's practices, let's say for kids and some of the varsity teams. They were all impacted by some of the issues with EEE and whatnot in West Nile. So anyway, the quality of life still comes into play in terms of the assessments, and then incorporating them into the plan also will be important. So I guess the take-home message for you is to really think about what message you really want to relay and when you want to relay it. So if it's for budgetary needs, financials, like I said, buying equipment, buying products, that's one thing. You could also look at it in terms of justifying increased labor. Another half-time person in the summer, whatever it can be, you could utilize that for the message. And does the message change? So if you're talking to the athletic director that's trying to schedule all these games, maybe you can argue with him, all right, you want to schedule games, but don't practice in this field or this area. Move it to another location. It's not easy, but you have the backup information that could substantiate some of that in terms of where and whatnot. And even for your own administration, because they might be, keeping documents that has this IPM plan has to stay in the Board of Education's, it's within their purview, the superintendent's office, but bottom line, maybe they will better understand what you're really trying to do and what you have been doing if you have some of the record keeping there. And can it counter some legislation or support it? So, some of these groups now, some of these associations, park and rec directors, parks groups, they're really trying to fight any of the new legislation when it comes up, so that they say right now we're still gathering information at hand from that standpoint. It will help with talking points in terms of some of the challenges moving forward. And then the other thing that will be nice is that you can also look to best practice documents to help support the argument as well. But you're always going to be faced, obviously, with some of these challenges. So, like our document, we did this in 2013. We're updating it this year, so we'll have another document for school grounds managers that they can utilize to help support them in terms of best practices. Here at STMA, we're going to be undertaking our big template for BMPs. That's another huge thing that will help you as sports turf managers. And then, extension faculty, these were some we did in Connecticut, but we tried to look at getting information not only in the hands of school grounds managers. I mean, we have workshops once, sometimes twice a year for school IPM, but it's the administration, it's the athletic directors, and some of the other groups that really don't understand how you have to sidestep things to make safe playing fields for them. So we have created documents for the administration and actually for some of the parent groups that come in, so that if they're expecting certain things to occur and happen, from their standpoint. So that's it for me. I don't know if there's any questions about what we've done, any other further information. I guess for those of you that, for nothing else, and I've mentioned this before when I've spoken about it, really it's a take-home message. The sooner you start, if you anticipate some legislative issues coming your way, the more documentation that you have, the better off you will be, one way or another. So.